Art as research and artistic research, like other kinds of academic or scholarly or research-based inquiry, produces knowledge. That's what artists produce, and they produce knowledge through the specific means that are artistic.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. If you've been around art in the last several decades or so, you likely have heard the term institutional critique. This is a genre of art that turns the lens back onto the world around the art object as its subject, finding playful or polemical ways to provoke thought on art's unspoken rules and expectations and links to the wider world. Andrea Fraser is one of the artists who has most helped define institutional critique as a genre and as a practice. She has done this in artworks that sometimes look like performances or lectures or works of research, but also in her essays and theoretical writings. One of her recent essays, The Field of Contemporary Art, a Diagram, published over at eFlux Notes, is an attempt literally to map out how contemporary art is not one thing, but a landscape of different competing camps and value systems so that you might figure out where you stand within it. She calls this theory a resource to make sense of a field that makes no sense, and she agreed to talk with me about it. It does contain a diagram, so if you want to, you can look that up. We'll link to it in the show notes. Andrea Fraser, thank you for talking to me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak with you, Ben. This is great.
Well, I am very excited to talk to you. I have so much that I want to pick your brain about that I want to get right into it. I found this text of yours, recent text, The Field of Contemporary Art, a Diagram, and I thought it was just a revelation and snapped into focus some things I've been thinking about art and seemed like a development in the way you think about the art world, although I know it's an evolution over many years. So in this text, you break up what we think of as one art world into 5 different art subfields. The art market subfield, the exhibition subfield, the academic subfield, community-based subfields, and the field of cultural activism. So where did this idea come to you, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, well, it's called The Field of Contemporary Art, a Diagram, and the essay is an elaboration of this diagram that I have been developing. I first put this diagram together actually for a kind of a workshop with my graduate students at UCLA during COVID. And one of my students was taking a class looking at W.D. Du Bois diagrams.
Oh, yeah. This is like data art before its time.
Which are amazing, incredibly beautiful, and had been sort of tasked in that class of diagramming their work, their interest, their practice. And I thought, well, this is brilliant. So I asked all of my graduate students to put together diagrams to somehow try to graphically represent their practices. And then I put together this diagram rather than diagramming my own practice. I diagrammed the field of art as a way of sort of framing that. So that was in 2021, I think. But the diagram itself is based on things that I've been thinking about, at least 15 years probably, and does represent really 40 years of my thinking about and trying to understand the field of contemporary art and its institutions. And what the diagram represents is a hypothesis that the art field, the art world, or the field of art, to use Pierre Bourdieu's term, is fragmenting into increasingly autonomous subfields. And
Right.
that this is a process that was spurred by the massive expansion of the art world starting in the 1990s through what I describe as sort of successive waves of growth. First, the kind of globalization of the art world, the biennial phenomena that everybody was talking about, in the late 90s, the emergence of curatorial studies programs, of sort of a discipline, a field of practice, discourse, a discipline of curatorial studies. Then in the early, 2000s, the massive expansion of the art market, the proliferation of art fairs, the financialization of the art market. And then sort of along with both of those phenomena, the explosion in the number and type of art-related degree programs. So, the first of the biennial phenomena, the kind of emergence of curatorial studies and so forth, represented the sort of expansion, but also the kind of consolidation, almost as an independent field or institution, of what I call the field of exhibitions. And then, we can recognize the art market. And then also kind of considering how something like an academic field developed as a subfield of the art world. I mean, there had been, you could say, an artistic subfield of academic fields, right, with art history and studio art education. But really, I think with the emergence of this sort of recognized field of practice and increasingly kind of institutionalized field of practice of artistic research, and the boom in PhD programs in studio art, which, is primarily a European phenomena that had to do with European Union policy.
And a relatively new thing, this idea of artists with PhDs.
Right. I mean, it was on the heels of the Bologna process in the EU, which was sort of bringing all of the higher education in the European Union into sort of standardizing it, which sort of opened the floodgates of funding, really, for PhD programs in studio art. So these phenomena, created a sort of on the heels of this expansion, also represented a kind of consolidation, if you will, of each of these fields. And so the hypothesis that is represented by the diagram is that in the art world today, maybe we can still talk about one art world, but increasingly artists, artistic practices, art discourse are located in specific subfields and that are actually sort of, in many respects, sort of like radically functioning in radically different social spaces, economies, institutions with, radically different and often conflicting perspectives on what art is, what artists do that's of value or worth to society, different criteria, different artistic practices. And so those four subfields in my diagram are then represented and positioned within coordinates developed by Pierre Bourdieu.
Which has to do with what kind of power defines success and where power is and how much power people have. And yeah, it's another remarkable thing about this graph, which people can look up, which is that it actually locates the different games you might be playing or subcultures. I don't even, I guess social fields is what they are, social subfields. But I have definitely felt this, that you suddenly feel like you're playing a different game. You're in a different social world where the rules of prestige are reversed or function very differently. Mm-hmm. Like you said, this comes from a long train of thought that you've had. I was reading up on past essays and I found a footnote in like a text from 2012, I think, where you lay out these subfields or you talk about the problem with subfields within art. I feel as if this is an evolution of your thinking, though, in terms of institutional critique. You're one of the artists most associated with institutional critique, and it's kind of an evolution in the institution, right? In how institutions function or what the institution of art is.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of the essay begins with a kind of historical gloss, and at my most kind of I suppose, ambitious or grandiose with regard to this hypothesis. I'm describing this current configuration of the art world, I think, as the fourth or fifth iteration of the art field as it developed within the West, European tradition.
In art history.
In the West, yeah. And then sort of expanded through colonialism and globalization, starting with it sort of early era sort of medieval Renaissance period of aristocratic and ecclesiastic patronage, where artists basically functioned in guilds and had, no autonomy, to the emergence of aesthetic theory, Enlightenment aesthetic theory, and symbolic systems, which identified aesthetics and aesthetic experience as a kind of end in itself, and then Romanticism and the Romantic reaction to industrialization, which put into place sort of notions of artistic genius and inspiration in some sense, and also a sense of artists functioning against the forces of capitalism and industrialization, sort of in some ways have their origin to that period. And then actually, ironically, and sort of most importantly, in some respects, the emergence of the bourgeois art market, in the context of which artists sort of stopped working on commission, and became sort of independent, autonomous producers who have authority over their own labor in a certain sense. And the sort of freedoms that we associate with art making and with art production are really emerged with the bourgeois art market. And with this, I follow Bourdieu's analysis in a way, and how these conditions laid the groundwork for the emergence of modernism and avant-garde art as autonomous fields of production and reception.
Autonomous meaning with their own internal criteria.
Yeah, Bourdieu has a couple of different ways of defining autonomy. I mean, one that's sort of a fun one. He defines autonomous producers as producers who produce only for the recognition of those whom they recognize. So it's like tiny mutual admiration societies, except in fact, what determines their structure is that they're not mutual admiration societies, but societies of sort of competition between and among people who share the same kind of specific competence, right? And so with that, there's a distinction between producers who produce for other producers who are also their competitors versus producers who produce for people who are not other producers, who are consumers, who do not share the specific competence of producers. And that would be one of the ways that one could think about the distinction between small scale or restricted, or what has been called elite or high culture, and popular or mass culture. Is not in terms of scale so much as in terms of the kinds of competencies that are assumed or demanded by production. And one of the other ways that Bourdieu has defined autonomy, or the autonomy of fields, which is always a relative autonomy. It's not an absolute autonomy, of the sort that certain sort of political and aesthetic philosophers might be reaching for, but a relative autonomy, and that is autonomy relative to other fields, is the capacity of a field, of the artistic field, to sort of define and insist on, impose its own specific criteria of value and valuation to the exclusion of the criteria that dominates other fields, or that defines hierarchies of success or position in other fields. And in that respect, I mean, historically, he identified the way that artistic criteria rejected or excluded or even inverted economic criteria.
Right. That's the important thing, I think, or one of the important
things. That
is
one of the most important principles for Bourdieu. But there's been a tendency and a kind of a risk almost of universalizing those conditions. And from a Bourdieu's perspective, those are very specific historical and social conditions under which a particular kind of field that is, you can sort of say, was the kind of context of modernist and avant-garde practice developed.
I mean, one of the things that is so impressive about the text for me in defining these 5 different subfields of art is that they are kind of freestanding worlds. There's a different criteria of success that you lay out, a different relationship to audience, and also different ways of sustaining yourself within each of them. So they're all, whatever autonomy each of them has, it's always in relationship to other ways that people survive and practice, but that they really have separated off into different kinds of way of thinking about art if it's not a career.
So I identify these 5 subfields, and certainly there are more. And the community-based subfield is not one subfield, but like hundreds or thousands, of subfields, as many as there are communities. And each of those subfields, can be characterized in terms of its economy. Is it for-profit, nonprofit, public, DIY, and so forth? But the term that I associate with each field that's been the most valuable for me is, and I don't have a clear word for this, but it's sort of like, what is it that artists produce? Within each of those fields, sort of define what artists produce differently, of what art is and what art does. Perhaps it's most obvious in the academic field where this is quite explicit. Artists produce knowledge. Art as research and artistic research, like other kinds of academic or scholarly or research-based inquiry, produces knowledge. That's what artists produce, and they produce knowledge through the specific means that are artistic. In community-based subfields, artists produce community. In the activist subfields, artists produce and art produces social change. What might be a little bit more controversial is how I identify what artists produce or how art is defined within the exhibition and the market subfields, where I suggest that in the exhibition subfield, what artists produce above all is experience. And this relates to a way of, now I think pretty accepted thinking about the exhibition field as part of an experience economy. But it also is a reflection on the nature of exhibitions and the nature of the criteria that seem to determine what gets selected for exhibitions, increasingly. And then in the market field, what artists produce is value. We can define value in different ways. And I think there's a kind of critical perspective on that, where it's like, oh, it's all about financial value or market value or economic value. But I would suggest that, first of all, it is artistic value. I mean, it's artistic value that in some ways becomes directly, more or less directly convertible, into economic value. But the market, interestingly, is still the arena in which, in some ways, artistic value as such, as perhaps it has been defined traditionally in aesthetic and other traditions, sort of still pertains. But the problem there, is that any kind of autonomy of artistic value within that context is relatively quickly lost, to
Yeah.
market forces and to economic
Yeah, you
value.
just become treated like a product easily. But I mean, I guess it's the most dominant one that relates to how your entire graph is made out of tensions between dominant and dominated.
So in the graph, we talked about, so these subfields are organized within a set of coordinates. And the horizontal axis, which comes from Bourdieu, represents on the one side, on the left side, appropriately, if you will, the diagram, cultural capital, and on the right side, economic capital. And so there's a sort of a scale, and Bourdieu suggested, that this is in a certain way a kind of hypothesis about what structures social space, and that cultural fields as social spaces are structured by the distribution and the relative weight or importance of these two different forms of capital, of value, of power, of criteria.
Bourdieu, most famous for the concept of cultural capital. If people don't know his work, you may know that concept, which is that there's other forms of authority that aren't just financial authority.
Right, exactly. There's been an argument that, well, cultural capital is dead, and the art world is now completely defined by economic capital. But I think when you think about it, you can sort of see how the sort of space of the art field is still structured according to distributions of those forms of capital. And that's the horizontal axis. So the question is, if the autonomy of the art field relative to other forms of capital or other forms of power has depended on, historically, within this perspective, the capacity of kind of cultural capital to be the dominant principle of hierarchization, the dominant principle of status, of power, and so on and so forth. And so you can sort of, going from left to right, you can sort of map in a certain way how that autonomy, or how the sort of weight of cultural capital sort of changes within the market field, but it's still at work in the market field, I would say.
Because ideally, for instance, in the academic world, or in the world of intellectual production, that the most important person or most important artist is not the most marketable artist. It's the person who contributes most to the intellectual field in ways that might be in tension with the market.
Right. And one of the, I suppose, pieces of evidence, that I can evoke to support this hypothesis of this sort of theory of the art world is, I think, the pretty indisputable fact that many of us have observed. There are artists who are very successful in the market, who sell their work, at high prices, and whose work is basically never written about, never taught, doesn't exist in any kind of world of sort of scholarly, study, and even rarely shown in museum contexts, right? And then there are artists whose work is constantly written about and taught and, sort of at the forefront of art historical and scholarly research, and whose work doesn't sell. So,
Oh, for sure.
in a certain way, that was one of the things that, me being maybe one of the artists on that side of things, that it's like, what's going on here? How is this functioning? And then one can also now, with the field of exhibitions, this is also true that there are artists who are very, very sort of successful, and I put those in quotes, whatever that means, but whose work is very present in the world of international exhibitions and survey exhibitions and public programs, but who have no market, and even in many cases have sort of limited academic or intellectual reception.
That is, again, one of the things I just found most convincing and that I connected with on the level of my own experience, because I have felt very much for the last maybe decade, but accelerating in recent times, that in terms of exhibition spaces and market spaces, definitely that they were diverging. I mean, I think there's always been a divergence because, the distinction between economic and cultural capital is obviously very old, as comes from Bourdieu. He's talking about the 19th century, really. But I have felt, and when I've looked sort of empirically at, the artists being shown most in exhibitions versus galleries, it is clearly a different cast of characters. It's interesting to me that something you mentioned in the text that I'd like to hear more about is it started for you. In some ways, this thought started for you with a proposal for an exhibition, one of these big surveys, Documenta 14, where you were kind of taking some of these thoughts and trying to create a provocation about really embracing the fragmentation of art worlds, like surfacing that. So maybe tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, actually, I think the earliest version of this comes out of the essay that I wrote in 2011 called Le 1% C'est Moi, which was about the intimate connection between the art market boom of that time and of the last, 3 decades, and the massive global wealth concentration that we've been seeing during that period. And that essay was very much of a polemic, and it ends with a vision of artists and curators and scholars and holders of cultural capital of withdrawing that cultural capital from the art market, so the art market would just split off, into the luxury goods sector and the financial markets that it was increasingly becoming anyway. The idea that this sort of splitting off of the market would enable the rest of the art world to retain some of the autonomy that it seemed to be losing to that market. And that way of thinking then further developed when I was invited to make a proposal for Documenta 14. And at that point, I had been thinking also of the function of survey exhibitions and also of art discourse, the kind of regressive role that survey exhibitions play, actually. If one thinks about the historical development of the field toward this sort of fragmentation and toward the increasing autonomy of these subfields, that they might even emerge as fields in themselves and no longer as subfields, that exhibitions like Documenta, and I was thinking of maybe the last few that I'd seen, as well as, all kinds of biennials.
The big ones, yeah. The big shows that set the discourse.
Right. They sort of pull together artists and practices and positions that really, as if they exist in the same field, as if they exist in the same social space, as if there's a kind of continuum between Jeff Koons and community-based
Andrea Fraser.
Well, whatever, I was thinking of more radical positions some ways than my
community
own,
murals or something like that.
As if there's a kind of continuum between the sort of big market artists and community-based artists who reject the market, as if there's a continuum between artists who are engaged in research-based practice and artists who, are sort of producing large-scale public spectacle. And so my proposal was that to invite different sort of sub-curators, if you will, or curatorial teams from these different subfields to create exhibitions that corresponded to their criteria and their values. And then to have these exhibitions and these positions kind of confront each other across the space of the exhibition as a whole, and to have that debate about what those values are, what that criteria is, what are the sort of areas of conflict and incompatibility, as well as the potential dialogue between those. So, I was not selected. So that exhibition never
Too bad.
happened.
It would have been a cool show. I would have loved to see what that looked like.
So my thinking about this continued to develop from that point.
And that's the development I kind of want to get at, because I think, as it said, this began in an essay thinking about inequality and the intense domination of art by money, which is something you have written quite a lot about, and it's one of the main threads throughout your work. And this kind of idea that maybe let's just be clear that we're not a part of that and embrace these other forms of cultural power. And then it seems like this is a development in the way you think about institutions and where the object of critique is. Because, am I wrong? It seems like you sort of realized, oh, just when you think you're outside of power, you're back in, and all of these other forms of languages of art or subfields of art are in their own way part of this same art system that exploded since the 90s or the 2000s or wherever you want to mark it, that entangle you in different ways, in different forms of power games, and that it would be false to think you were finding some sort of pure space outside of them in academia, in exhibitions, which I have to say personally has been part of the, anguished conversation of the last 10 years when there's all these new protest movements thinking about power, that all the different forms of power get questioned, and you kind of, where you thought your safe space was vanishes in a certain sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that all does reflect some of my thinking. I mean, I think the primary motivation for getting this essay out, I mean, had a lot to do with my role as a full-time professor and, in a public university, and just
Sure. I mean, there's quite a lot of angst about art school and art teaching.
sort of thinking like, all the students that I work with, the young artists that I see starting their careers, it just seems like, wow, what a mess. I mean,
Yeah.
it's I mean, not a mess because there's, they're making great work, but often they just have agendas that seem to me at cross purposes with itself. In a certain way, the essay, which was published in Eflux Notes, which is, of course, a particular kind of platform for a particular kind of intellectual orientation that I would locate firmly within an academic field, whether or not people actually have academic positions. It's a platform in which the discourse and the values of the writing are very much informed by certain kinds of theory that really comes out of the academic field, even if it has also very much a political context. Because this is sort of where the reflexive critique is, right? I mean, and reflexive critique is the way that I define institutional critique. It's not a critique of institutions, of museums, of big institutions, of sort of power, the market, or whatever, even academic institutions. But institutional critique for me is reflexive critique. And the reflexive critique here is a critique of, in some ways, of the academic art field or the academic subfield and its discourses, and it's in a certain way sort of self-mystification about its position in social space as somehow outside of and simply against other institutions and power bases in society. Whereas my perspective, again, which is very influenced by Bourdieu, is that the academic field, the intellectual field, as the site of concentrations of a particular kind of social power, which is cultural capital, are very much and very firmly located within what he calls the field of power and within its own set of institutions. And to me, that's a very, very important thing to recognize, and especially now, because while in some ways it seemed sort of less urgent for, for a couple of decades, since Bourdieu was writing this in the 80s, it's now become incredibly urgent in a sense because when you think about the political field, and that is the field of electoral politics and the field of sort of power politics, is now really deeply defined and structured by this struggle between cultural and economic capital, where the right is defining class entirely in terms of education and cultural capital, and vilifying cultural and educated elites, and bringing a large segment of the working class along with it in that way of conceptualizing power, and politics. Whereas the left, both the liberal left, the center liberal left, and the far left, have a terrible record, have been very, very bad, actually, I think, historically, in recognizing and reflecting on the kind of power that they hold, the power of cultural capital as a form of power and as a form of domination, and the degree to which there are structures of domination at work in society that are rooted in education and cultural capital. That's where I sort of end the essay. I mean, there's a section on politics in a sort of meta sense, as opposed to I think when I started writing it, I was thinking about, this question that many people in the art field ask, especially people within sort of academic community-based and cultural activist segments of the art field, of, what constitutes a political art or a political practice or effective political practice or effective resistance or subvert, and so on. But it ended up being a kind of more about the sort of metapolitics of the status of the struggle between cultural and political capital.
It occurs to me listening to you to ask, does the current political state of things, current, breakdown really of the political order, does it change the way you think about the object of critique? I guess I think for a lot of people, you who have their eyes open or have their eyes opened, come into art and they see like the museum, the entanglements of the museum as, suddenly really urgent. Like the museum's the Death Star, the art market is evil because of entanglement with wealth, and the academia is, full of its own, like you said, privilege and compromises and so on. And so the object of critique is those institutions of power which are nearest to you, but also have historically had like this liberal gloss on them. And then here we're in this political moment where, those institutions of power are, actually kind of all under assault in their own kinds of ways. Even the art market, it's not clear to me that, the MAGA right wants the kind of cultural capital that is still vaguely attached to, paintings and art history, anything that's not, directly political signaling in the way that everything has to be now in this media environment. Does any of this change the way you think about, institutional critique or reflexive critique?
Yeah, there's so many different ways, directions I could go in response to that question. I mean, one is the irony of having written this essay when I did, after thinking about it for 10 to 15
Isn't that the way it is?
years. Like, I'm finally going to get this essay out, and the whole essay is premised on a way of understanding the consequences of this 3 or 4 decades, if not more, of continuous kind of massive exponential global expansion of the art world. And then right as I was finally publishing it, it sort of became clear that all of that was coming to a crashing halt. Museums and the art world seems to be entering a period of degrowth, as maybe much of the world is. And in fact, I think ultimately that's a really good thing. on many levels. And I think the art world expanded well beyond any kind of rational sort of scale, largely through the largesse of ultra high net worth individuals. So that's one thing that happened. And that's not only the crash of the art market, but certainly in the US, it's also something that museums are very concerned about. I mean, in the past few years, for a number of reasons, but a lot of the sort of the base of patronage seems to have dried up. And the sort of older kind of post-war boomers generation of patrons and also collectors are dying off. And there isn't a sense that a new generation of patrons and collectors who hold a certain level of belief in the value of cultural institutions and art are sort of coming in to take their place. And so there's almost a kind of a panic that I've perceived among museum development people. Of course, the other thing which you mentioned is now the sort of, concerted political assault on the autonomy of any kind of civil society institutions that we're seeing from the Trump administration, which certainly does shift my thinking, as someone who for decades has been critical of the nonprofit sector and of the whole system of tax incentivized patronage. Now, the Trump administration is taxing university endowments, threatening changes to the tax policy that underlies the nonprofit sector. Then I have to rethink my perspective on some of that. The sort of analysis that this essay and this diagram comes out of, Bourdieu's analysis, is incredibly useful and actually essential for understanding what's going on now. And that is sort of basically his theory of the field of power. The diagram is just a hypothetical field of art. It's a rectangle with other rectangles within it, right? But within that sort of Bourdieusian framework, that rectangle, the field of art, is situated within another rectangle that represents what Bourdieu calls the field of power. And then the field of power is located within another rectangle that we could call sort of society as a whole, right?
It's rectangles all the way
I
down.
know. I mean, it's a beautiful minimalist conceptual artwork from my perspective. So in Bourdieu's theory of the field of power is that, and this is where he sort of diverges very explicitly from Marxism, is instead of talking about the dominant class that's defined sort of exclusively in economic terms, in terms of relations of production or ownership of capital and economic capital and the means of production, he's sort of saying, well, economic power is not the only form of power that structures social space. There are other forms of power that structure social space. And then theorizes the field of power as a space in which all of those forms of power that are operative in that structured social space are concentrated, and in fact, within that are competing with each other. So the field of power is not just a sort of site from which domination emanates, but itself a site of struggle among different forms of power. And he identified cultural capital, economic capital, social capital as primary forms of power. I also, in my diagram, add dominant and dominated identities as forms of power that are identity-based, that are racialized, that are gendered. But that kind of basic analysis of the field of power as a site of struggle, especially between cultural and economic power, I think right now is incredibly important and useful for understanding what's going on politically in the United States and globally, because one has basically the far right taking on cultural power, taking on cultural capital, taking on and vilifying and attacking and trying to basically eliminate all social institutions and social sites in which cultural power is concentrated with any kind of autonomy from political power and economic power. And so that puts me in a position of sort of really like wanting to defend that form of
I
power,
mean, it's
right?
also why just from my own perspective, I still hold on to the basic kind of Marxist point about economic power being kind of ultimately determinating, because I kind of feel like we're living through the revenge of that in a certain sense, that it's like the autonomy of cultural capital was kind of an optical illusion. Adam Curtis calls it a playpen that we were put in during neoliberalism. You can do your politics over here. In the end, who has the money and who has the guns is where the real power is. Whatever kind of power, which is not insignificant, cultural capital was, because I think your analysis is brilliant at, I think, showing the blindnesses that certain kind of like liberal coded cultural discourse had towards it, the way it read in the world, how phony it seems, how disconnected from the structures of domination that actually govern people's lives outside in the bigger rectangle are. You describe the graph as a tool to make sense of a senseless field. You describe how
Well, that's senseless, but that
makes
makes no
no
sense.
sense.
I mean, it has a
Important
sense. It's
distinction.
not that it's
Important
senseless.
distinction.
It has a sense.
Well,
It's
multiple
just very
senses, I suppose. And you also just say that when you show it to your students, one of the most common reactions is, how do I get out of this? How do I escape this? Which I think you find very naive. So I guess, how do you position yourself, in this fragmented field? I feel like reading your writing, looking at your work is like one long internal monologue about how you live honestly within art and against art. How do you position yourself within this fragmented world?
I mean, one of the very, very peculiar things about the art world is that it's a field in which so many of the people who really put an enormous amount of effort and time and money and just energy into being within it are deeply ambivalent, if not conflicted about being within it, right? Like, what is that about? It's hard to think about any other field where one finds that situation, that there's so many people in the art world who are so deeply critical of it and sort of say on some level or feel that they don't want to be in it. One of the ways of thinking about that I've also gotten from Bourdieu is that if the field of art can be understood as a dominated field within the field of power, a dominated field within the dominant field. So it's a site of tremendous wealth, tremendous power, and at the same time, the site of discourses and practices which believe and position themselves as contesting and rejecting that wealth and power. And that is kind of contained within the same field. And a way of understanding that sort of sociologically is that reflects the sort of internal, the kind of structural conflict of the field of art as a dominated field within the field of power. And I think that in a way, people who are drawn to the art field are people who sort of share that experience of conflict in some way, both sort of socially and psychologically, and hold that, and that's actually the kind of basis for the critical tendencies, for the basis for the possibility and the desire to kind of have a critical practice within the field, more than any kind of sort of whatever sort of transcendent way of thinking about artistic autonomy or something might be, that there's a social basis for that. So I'm sort of caught myself in that role as a professor between, on the one hand, my own belief in the art field as an institution of critique and that that's its value. And on the other hand, of not wanting my students to sort of crash and burn, and not wanting my students to embark on trajectories that are completely sort of self-defeating. But when it comes to sort of, well, where does that leave you? Of course, it leaves you with too many different sort of options, right? And it's complex. One thing that I end up doing a lot with students is trying to sort of challenge them to figure out, well, really, what are your values? And what are the artistic criteria or social or political criteria or intellectual criteria that derive from those values, that hold those values? And to develop a practice based on that, and then to sort of think about okay, maybe those criteria and those values aren't represented or reflected by any kind of social space in the art field, but it's from that basis that you can test the criteria or values that might be institutionalized in those fields, right? And from the basis of a sense of how those values are rooted in your own social experience of yourself, of your community, of your experience of domination, of your experience of marginalization, or of a kind of critical experience of your privilege as well. So that's one place that I try to go. And maybe that means that ultimately those values cannot be held within the art field. And there are other ways to look and to think about certainly community-based subfields and cultural activist subfields. I do think they extend out of the art field and also out of the field of power.
The entire project is looking at complexity and trying to help people clarify values. I think the text does that, the graph does that, and hopefully this conversation does a little bit of that. But I really appreciate you talking to me. I think it's been very engaging and clarifying for me.
Well, I really appreciate you reaching out and giving me this opportunity to share this perspective. It's been great talking with you.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also take a moment to rate and review The Art Angle. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.